Thank you everybody for joining us today here at the Arts House. My name is Ken Tan. I'm the Senior Director of Programming and Producing at Arts House Limited. So the Arts House, we are this Arts House is one of the venues in which Arts House Limited, the company I work for, manages, and we are actually focused on supporting Singapore arts. So we are very thrilled, myself, to have these two creative leaders here to discuss actually the main purpose of this whole exhibition. So you get to hear it from them. I Rise. So the whole purpose, at least for me, is the juxtaposition of creativity between human and machine. Okay, just a very simple kind of like premise that we are working with here. Why this purpose? When I first met Professor Immanuel Koh many months ago on Zoom, very fittingly we met on Zoom for the first time, I actually saw one of his architectural structures that he showed me in one of these. And immediately I was drawn to the kind of liberties this machine AI actually can take when generating such a structure. For example, I was particularly interested in a certain errand block, a little piece that's like floating in the air, which, with my background being in the visual arts and the arts, immediately I connected it with like a painter in an expressive painting. He would have an errand mark as well, just because he felt that little line there makes, that little brushwork there makes it all better. So I thought about that, but it was not until I met Mr. Ong during the launch of the Cultural Medallion showcase on level 1 downstairs some months ago, late last year, that actually this curatorial connection, I could actually make it in the head. Like, wouldn't it be interesting if I put these two gentlemen together? His lyrical watercolors, as you can see, is the perfect and necessary kind of counterpoint to this whole exhibition. So now, I'm thinking to myself, Picasso said once, art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. So there's more guests coming in. Yeah, please come in. Okay. So Picasso once said that art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. And only Picasso, I feel, can make something so complex, so complicated, sound so simple. So I think what he meant, art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. What I think he meant is, which is very relevant in this show, is the balance between objectivity and subjectivity. This kind of like exchange between the maker, the artist, the force making this thing, and the audience, the viewer. And that currency of the exchange is one of, I think, value, human values. So over here, what we are trying to do is, if you have seen, if you have came here a little bit earlier, or the previous weeks where this exhibition was on, and if you've spent time with the works in this show, you can see, of course, they look very different. It's evident. The aesthetic value is definitely different. But today we're not so much discussing what the differences are, but really in this short talk, in this short presentation, to just put to you these two schools and perhaps heighten the kind of like awareness for both of them through their works, and also impress upon you the kind of overlaps that they have and the unique beauty that each school, this discipline will take. So without further ado, let me just introduce my guest. Professor Immanuel Koh, he's one of the key international figures in the emerging field of artificial intelligence and architecture. Immanuel obtained his PhD from the School of Computer Sciences and Institute of Architecture at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland. A graduate from the prestigious Architectural Association in London, where he also taught, then at the London Royal College of Art. He also taught at Harvard GSD and many others worldwide. Today, he holds a joint assistant professorship at the Architecture and Sustainable Design and Artificial Intelligence at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, SUTD. He has won many, many awards for his works, including the Golden Pin Design Award, and was nominated for the Superior AI Leader Award. And his book, which you will find at the back of this room, and also secondly, we realized selling next door in the book fair, his book Artificial and Architectural Intelligence in Design is a first to reflect on the epistemological implications of AI on architecture and vice versa. So Immanuel has exhibited extensively internationally at Venice Architectural Biennale, Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Shanghai's 3D Printing Museum, and now we are proud to have him here at the Arts House. Mr. Ong Kim Seng, he's no stranger to the Singapore artistic landscape. He is internationally renowned watercolorist and one of Singapore's most prominent artistic icons, whose name is synonymous with his lyrical watercolors. Self-taught, this artist has participated in many, many exhibitions, not only in Singapore, but it's going to be an exhaustive list, but United States, China, UK, Japan, Australia, Belgium, Germany, France, Middle East, you name it. He has made history for Singapore actually in 1990, where he became the first Asian member to be named on the register of the American Watercolor Society, following the winning of many awards, including 6 awards from the same society, eventually resulting him in being named a Dolphin Fellow with the society. He has played a very active part in today's artistic landscape, and also in a lot of prestigious art fellowships and organization. He was the president of the Singapore Watercolor Society from 1991 to 2001, subsequently becoming the honorary president. And finally, he is the coveted Cultural Medallion Award, as I have mentioned, was conferred on Mr. Ong in 1990, you see, for his contributions in Singapore's visual arts. So thank you and welcome. So Mr. Ong, let me start with you and we'll just jump into this. Can you tell us all very briefly about your process, your plein air process, how you got started, what attracted you?
I think it's on.
How do you on this thing?
I think it's on, yeah.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Oh, you can't hear? You can hear like that myself without the mic, huh? It's better, otherwise it will echo, no?
Yeah, if you want.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my process is very simple. It's just like any child will start dabbling with all sorts of art material. When I was young, well, there's such a thing, maybe they call a born painter or born talent or whatever. So I use old newspapers to draw. So you just go on. For anything that you want to master, you need to practice. So all the time is always a kind of a day in, day out kind of drawing and painting. And from drawing, it became painting. So in primary school, I won several awards. There was no one to teach me how to go about painting. It just comes by itself. I don't know how it comes, but it's just like you learn how to eat and how to drink. So art is just like that. So in furtherance to that, I win awards, and there were teachers encouraging me that, that is a good way of painting. So in secondary school, I joined an art class. And we have art class, we go outing. Then we start to paint outdoor, going outdoor to paint in the 60s, 1960s. That was many, many years ago. And in the inter-school art competition, I win some more awards. The process is this, they're looking at a scene. You go to the scene. Normally is a painting at a scene. Some may say that this is copying the scene. But it's not just copying. It's something that you want to see in your painting, what you want to depict in your painting. So that is normally the process. The process is just asking yourself, what is the most interesting part in the scene that you are looking? So then you embark on a place where you think that there is most interesting. You start from there. And once you achieve that, the rest will follow. So completing a painting is most important that you have to find the most interesting part. The colors will come automatically. Well, colors is a person's personality, the way how you depict the scene. You don't just copy the scene as it is. It goes through you and you interpret it. Some people they call it digestion, a scene digestion, how you digest and how you interpret. So that's how a painting is being completed.
Yeah. So the plein air process, you were outdoors and you were attracted by certain things you see. And those things, I mean, you grew up in Tiong Bahru, and with a lot of the paintings here in the show, which is very clear, they are of, a very Singaporean landscape, the shop houses, the alleyways, but you have also been all over the world. So now that you have done this for a while, is there certain kind of visual cues, you talked about color, is there certain visual kind of language that when you go onto a scene, you are trying to read and pick out that will interest you? And if so, what are they?
Well, when you talk about traveling overseas, I've been to many countries. And when I embark on a journey to any country, first it must be a country that interests me. Okay. A country that interests me. So two main countries that really interest me a lot is, one is the island of Bali and the kingdom of Nepal. It was a kingdom before, now it's already a republic. Well, both countries has its similarity in terms of its religion, in terms of its custom, in terms of the minorities who stay in that country. So there must be an interest before you do
this is
certain
a
things.
cultural
aspect of it. So, and I also heard a lot. Or normally, before I sat on this thing, I try to communicate with the artists in that country, with friends all over the world. If you are a watercolorist, normally you have friends who paint the same thing and do the same thing. So I get in touch with them and ask them, what are the places that you artists used to go, and what is it that attract you to go? So they took me to some places, some interesting areas, some areas that really, when you look at it, you thought that we are living in the medieval era, many, many years ago, 15th century, 16th century, because the place is still not so modernized, it's still in the third world stage. So of course there are a lot of areas that you want to show. The main thing you want to pick is what sort of buildings that interest you. Buildings that you don't see in your home country. Okay? The costume that people wear that you don't see in your country. The vegetation, the trees, the animals. Well, I'm not an animal painter, but sometimes I do include one or two dogs or cats in the painting. So these are the things that we look out. I look out for, and I think the artists also look out for them. So the visual language itself is telling about people that this is unique about this country. Something that you want to portray in that country. So for example, the island of Bali. Okay, Bali is actually is really a fantastic place. you have volcanoes, you have terraces, you have temples. Nepal, we have also mountains, but the mountains are much, much higher than Bali, of course, snow-capped mountains. They also have terrace, and they have temples as well. But it's a different, of course, the temples in Nepal are much, much older than that of Bali. Because Bali only started since after the kingdom of Srivijaya, after the Hindu sphere of influence that come all the way from Asia Minor, right into Indochina, right into the Pacific region. So Bali is also one of the countries that was once invaded and by the Hindu religion.
Mr. Ong, so sorry to cut you. I'm going to actually ask you later also about how you scan landscapes and all that. But now I'm just going to jump over to Prof. Koh. Just hold that thought about the visual language. Immanuel, you might want the mic. I think it's turned on.
It's very soft.
You just got to speak into it. Yeah. Okay, so let me ask you, can you, for the benefit of everyone here, just very briefly describe what the machine learning process is in architectural AI, and exactly from that process, what are we looking at here?
Right, can you hear me? Yeah. So actually, it's more, well, accurately speaking, is a deep learning process. So which has to do, which basically involve deep neural networks. So this is kind of the contemporary AI that we're talking about these days. In the old days, we talk about rule-based AI. So it's quite a paradigm shift. And the process, so what you're seeing here, at least the wall that we're looking, these three portraits, these represent three different stages of the evolution, basically three AI models that each of them has evolved differently for different duration. On the other side of the wall, you see another AI model that is way more evolved. So if you look at the titles from the left to the right, I call it 110 epochs, 115 epochs, 120 epochs, and the one behind, 2050 epochs. So epochs basically represent the number of generations that they have evolved. So you could say these ones are like toddlers. The one behind is more like an adult creator. So you would see the interpretation, or rather the creativity. Well, the toddler is a bit kind of more loosened up, right? You see structures that may seem plausible, may seem not plausible. The one behind seems quite familiar, like HDB in some sense, but still you could identify some divergence in there. So the process, I should put it quite briefly, as you said, quite different from Mr. Ong's process, clearly, is that you have a data set of 3D digital models of buildings, and then you design and train a neural network that been fed with these 3D models. And then after that, you allow the model to converge to a point where it's able to generalize, understand what a building is. Once it figures out, it could generate its own buildings on its own. So you can imagine the same analogy of a kid having seen many buildings, figure out how to draw a building. That is the easier explanation. If you're interested, actually, it is a bit more complicated because there are actually two AI models within each single model. Yeah,
we'll need like another 3 hours for that. Okay, so you said data set and you taught it with like visual data of models and all that. You also mentioned HDB, so these were all HDB models?
Yes.
Was it obtained through, how was it obtained? And how do you feed it to the computer?
So there are actually different sources, a mix of sources from Google Earth. So you have the 3D digital models, but not every single building is included in the Google Earth dataset. We also have the OpenMap 3D, OneMap 3D, sorry, in Singapore, which you could actually somehow crawl it and get some of them. But the thing is, with this project, we need the interior as well. So there is a kind of a synthetic aspect to it, where we have to also generate synthetic data to align the interior with the exterior. So yeah, it's not like a one-stop data source. But I think Singapore is very interesting because it's such an I think it's one of the most interesting artificial city-state because everything is kind of built from scratch in a way, and these HDB, they are so familiar, and it serves some sort of a context for people to kind of find it familiar, but because of these seems strangely familiar. That I think that makes it really quite interesting. At least there is something to compare with. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm just thinking like, okay, if it's scanned, whether it's Google Earth or it's fed in data models, interior, exterior, maybe it's a stretch, but to me, there's also this concept of like seeing, the computer seeing, learning, and kind of like making sense of the world, which is not unlike, you know, like I was going to jump into the question about when you actually, say, visit the world, but let's keep it in Singapore context. When you go to one of these places in Chinatown, how do you then scan, Mr. Ong, how do you then scan for this kind of like framing or composition? Like, is there a certain kind of like framework or theory you work within for you to pick out these scenes?
When I'm sitting here and when I read the subject of this talk, I can imagine myself just like a bullock cart chasing a supersonic jet, you know. Something which is so advanced, so technical, so scientific. Our Prof. Immanuel will be talking about that. So I don't want to use the word scan because that is a bit too advanced for me. Or say I'll just sit and I see. I observe the scene. Well, I mean, in the context of HDB, which just now Prof. Koh have spoken to you, I do HDB. In the year 2011, I did an exhibition which is called Home and Nation, and there's a book there, you know, there's a thick book that talks about HDB. So the concept of HDB is that not many artists would like to paint HDBs because they find it very static. It's like a box. Some people say, oh, all the time you are doing chocolate boxes. Nobody will buy that kind of painting. But of course, doesn't mean that the things that people don't buy, you don't do it. You just do it. I think the objective of being a painter is not just painting to sell. It's something that comes from the heart, that you live in the time of your time, what you want to show. About 100 years down the road, my ashes may even be gone, washed away. People can say, oh, there's such a thing as an HDB. The HDB has become a monument. You may have buildings which is, Prof. Koh had just now talked to you about. We will have building like that. You may have building that is floating in the air. You won't have them, you do not necessarily you need them to be on earth, you know. So, well, depicting a scene is, as I say, how you feel, what you want to show, what you want to show.
So that's a very great place to jump from. So how you feel, what you want to show, right? So take any of these scenes, for example, that we see here. Like, what kind of liberties then as an artist, when you sit there and observe, maybe you shift a bit left, a bit right, what kind of liberties do you take to actually change the scene in front of your eyes a little bit more? Do you exaggerate? Do you omit? Do you distort? Do you invent?
You always go with a very simple sentence. I always used to tell my students, you know, I conduct classes, you paint what you want to see. You don't paint what you see. Now, when the word you say that when you paint what you want to see, you add ingredients into your painting. You subtract things that you don't like from the scene. You see, some scenes may be funny, like a horse running, you know. It's very difficult to draw the legs because when you snap a horse running, the leg may be out of anatomy. it may become a lame horse. And that's the same when you go to paint a scene in Chinatown, and all of a sudden there's a lamppost in front, there's a big signboard that says no parking or something. Are you going to paint that? Right? So maybe in front there is an undertaker's shop. Are you going to paint that as well? No. People don't like it. The superstitious people may not like it. So you can always subtract areas that you don't like. And the other thing is the colors. Sometimes we drive on the road, we see some HDB buildings. Oh, they have really terrible colors, you know, they are painted. The color combination is so bad. But now at least they have improved. It suits the eye, something so that. See, when you paint, you must satisfy yourself. Some of you here may take up painting, you know. Some of you may paint during your leisure. And that goes for a liking towards certain colors. Some people may like the reds, some people may like the yellows, or the blues, or the orange. So that goes for dressing up also, the colors that you choose. So it's something very personal, something that you can interpret in your own way, and that goes for painting.
Thank you. By no coincidence, I'm also all black here. But so Prof. Koh asked you, so Mr. Ong has a very good point about, you know, the omission, the changing, the morphing and transformation, which kind of like, you know, draws me to the animation that we have behind here. You see this kind of like tweening, this kind of like transformation of forms. So can you talk a little bit about that? What are we seeing when that happens?
Right. For those who have seen the animation on the other side of the wall, you notice this seemingly endless morphing. So what's happening is that the AI model basically create this, we call it latent space. In fact, there's a phrase for it, a word for it, latent walk. Walking in super high dimension. So when I talk about dimension, we know that 2 dimensions is just a flat piece of paper, 3 dimension, X, Y, Z. But what the model is learning thousands of dimensions, which is not possible to visualize as humans, or even to think. It's highly abstract, seemingly. So the model we're basically picking a point in that 1,000 dimensions, and each point is a possible building. So the AI model has generated this continuous space of high dimensional space, where you could then easily pick, in theoretically, infinite number of different buildings.
So basically, it's just all these possibilities is just existing there.
Yeah, that's why you could morph it continuously.
Right.
It's not a discrete; it's a continuous walk. Every time you pass by a space, a point in that space is a building. That's why it's so smooth.
Right. So it's just there, and well, this is because of the time-based experience that we humans can see something transform. How then did you arrive at picking these instances?
Right. So it has to do with my kind of interest. I think previously I mentioned about I think in our own conversation about the uncanny. So I'm looking for this. Should I explain a bit about the uncanny?
Yes. So there's this term that when we were discussing, and this term popped up, uncanny. So what is uncanny in the work?
So just to give a bit of a context, when I talk about the uncanny, I'm actually referring to the uncanny valley, which is a term, a hypothesis by this robotics professor, Masahiro Mori, from 1970. So his hypothesis is this, in his case, in robotics domain, when robots become more and more human-like, there is this part where it dips down, it descends down into this uncanny valley where it becomes eerie, right, scary and strangely familiar actually, strangely familiar. So I'm interested in this kind of indeterminacy, this familiar yet unfamiliar, strange, but at the same time, there's newness in that space, that valley. In fact, more recently, Benjamin Breton, a social theorist, talked about the inverse uncanny valley, which is the time when we feel uncomfortable seeing ourselves through the eyes of AIs. That's why this inverse uncanny valley. And just to make it brief, is that in these are the ones that I've chosen because they have this strangely familiar aspect to it, and they are not quite. In fact, they are in the sequence, right? The one on the left is actually the youngest, meaning it has been trained for about 110 epochs. As we go across to a right, we start to see apartments appearing, although the last one on the right, right? But you've got this almost ridiculously non-economic way of thinking about circulation, where most of the areas in the building are designated for circulation. So it's interesting because it's unlikely an architect would design something like this because the gross floor area is just ridiculously wasteful, and the number of units that you can sell is ridiculously few, and that makes it quite strange in that sense. Yeah.
Okay. Which kind of like I'm thinking about what you said about the horse as well, because if you snap a certain moment in time, it might look very strange as well, the anatomy of the running horse. Back onto the topic of color, why are they all monochrome?
So this is my kind of architecture upbringing in that sense. Like the earliest modernists, it's always about form, it's not about color. Fine, the Bauhaus look at the three primary colors, which is not exactly primary colors. So I have that tendency, but also more specifically is the work from the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Italian radical architecture, the work of Super Studio. I think I included in the video as well. They have these two projects. So, one is called the Histogram of Architecture. The other one is called the Continuous Monument. So what they created is basically this white voxel, this kind of a white grid of 3D white cubes that create any kind of building. And I like that kind of statistical, machinic, neutralizing aesthetics. And I could have chosen all of them to be rendered in white, but I find it probably more leverageable if I colored the circulation in darker gray, the apartments in lighter gray, white in this case, and also the vertical circulation in another gray as well. But that is really for annotation. If I have a choice, I just do everything like the same gray, same black, or same white.
No, thanks. So actually, like all the works in the show was not created for the show. They were existing works, and we picked it out. So it actually landed itself really well to having this polarity, this sort of like two different schools. I just want to sum up here the first part of this talk. So beyond, of course, the visual differences, and hearing both of you explain a little bit about the process and the backgrounds of the disciplines here, kind of interesting, some points about the creative process, right? So there's this whole idea of like being selective. When you're seeing things, you just want to be selective. You also have this very kind of like focused observation, this kind of like visual input that you will put into some sort of a cognitive process. Then through your own experience, or in this case, the machine learning or the years that you have spent in the outdoors painting and learning, this combining faculty. So because of this talk, I did some research and I found this wonderful person, Ada Lovelace, whom you'll be very familiar with. Ada Lovelace can be considered one of the first computer programmers. She coined this term combining faculty, which I really like. It's like combining facts, things, ideas, compositions, everything into a new, original, endless, and also ever varying kind of combination. So that's what really the creative process is. Then of course, the intervention comes in. Okay, how do you be, that's the mastery, right? Like how do you edit? How do you omit? How do you change? How do you select and pick out into some sort of an artistic output which we see today. So just to sum up the first part, I want to go into the second part of the talk to talk a little bit about experience. So Mr. Ong, who or what has inspired you?
Well, I mean, when I sit here, I imagine myself as what the work and the things that are being done by the cavemen. The cavemen also paint the rock walls, the cave walls. So that's exactly what we are doing now, even now in the 21st century. So I have a lot of painters that I admire, many of them. First, I come to know about Sir William Russell Flynn, very traditional, transparent watercolorist. Then another one, we call it even the masters of watercolor today, call him as the god of watercolor. That's John Singer Sargent. And we are very fortunate enough that in our museum, Singapore Museum, we have a painting by John Singer Sargent of Sir Frank Swettenham. That's by John Singer Sargent. And John Singer Sargent is an expert in both fields, oil as well as watercolor. I have admired him a lot. He's a man ahead of his time. His washes. Now in watercolor painting, well, watercolor painting has evolved till today from the 18th, 19th century British watercolorists to the American watercolorists. And now you have crossed the ocean to mainland China. And mainland China have experimented in many ways where watercolor is interpreted just as accurate and as detailed as oil. So some of the artists that I admire from China, there's a long list of them which I cannot just call them by name. Most of them, like one of them is Guan Weixing, who paint portraits. And another American artist which I admire most is Sir Andrew Wyeth, who is also, he used very limited colors, very subtle colors, the earthen colors for his works. So these are some of the artists that I admire, and I really, follow their ways of painting technique. I think every artist should have somebody that you can follow in order to progress through the ages, and you, of course, you have your own way of interpretation.
Yeah. In a way, it's like, taking their experience and, understanding it a little bit for your own. It's the academic part of learning art history, right? But you teach as well. How does that also help with your own practice?
Well, every artist has his finer points of painting and working methods. So I apply them, and time and again I go overseas for joint workshops with other famous and experienced watercolorists from all over the world. I have it in China because the formation of the International Watercolor Society, the American Watercolor Society, the National Watercolor Society, the All China Federation of Watercolor Society, and now that was about 2 years ago, we formed the International Masters of Watercolor. And I'm now the present president of the International Masters of Watercolor, as well as the alliances. It comprises of all the famous painters in the world, famous watercolorists in the world. And we hold biannual biennales in Shanghai. Yeah.
So the teaching, so that part, how does that help with the teaching?
Well, as I say, you learn different methods.
I see.
I try to impart my methods to my students.
Okay.
Show them how you do certain areas. Each time new things comes.
Yes.
Each time when I mix with these famous painters from the world.
Okay. Yeah, this sort of like collaborative exchange.
Yes.
Okay. So Prof. Koh, so what inspires you? And I'm also going to ask you to answer on behalf of the machine. What inspires the machine?
Right. In terms of inspiration, it is quite a young kind of AI art is pretty young, right? The thing about the AI model that I've used for this exhibition, it only appeared in the research paper in 2014, the visual version in 2015, and artists only start playing around with it quite late. One example would be Rifik Anadol, who is very famous in its creation of immersive environments. But of course, I draw inspiration from my own, learning process. Like I came through this computational design, parametricism, agent-based modeling. That is this whole this kind of a even rule-based system, right, of computational design. So there is this backlog of previous experiences, inspiration. But I think the question about inspiration, I think the second question is quite interesting. So I think I will just start answering that. So if you talk about how the machine, what inspired the machine, right? That's the question. So I think at least in terms of how we design the AI model, there's always this idea of injecting noise, meaning randomness. And if you pull back into the way of human understanding, this randomness, chance encounter, right? John Cage and all that. This, in the case of a machine, is this artificial simulated serendipity, right? This injecting chance encounter within the system. And this is truly the case, even technically speaking. If you open the black box of, let's say, StyleGAN, which is kind of a popular generative adversarial network, a kind of generative model, you see that the noise is not only injected in the beginning, it's actually injected in the successive layers of the neural networks. And of course, you also have noise being brought in right from the beginning, where people they call it data augmentation, meaning you augment the data set first, so that you, not just for practical reason to increase, but also to help the model to learn and perform better. So in that sense, we are trying to inject inspiration via chance encounter, via noise. And there's this whole discourse on kind of randomness, right, in art, digital art, computer art, back in the 60s even.
So with the randomness, do you then score its output? I mean, it takes inspirational leaps of faith because of this thing that you injected, but then do you score it and say, hey, good job, and therefore it learns to do more of that next time?
Well, at least in this particular AI model that I'm using, it doesn't work quite that way. Where there are models where you give it some kind of objective and it try to fulfill that objective via some kind of a policy, like in the case of the Go, right, AlphaGo, playing chess. You have an objective, is to win it, and then you reward it accordingly. And there's a kind of a very clear criteria of success. So if we talk about inspirational leaps, what might it mean? So I've been thinking about this idea recently also. In the case of an AI model, is that it's trying to kind of converge to the point that it hits. In the AI world, we call it the minimum, like the local. So it's actually quite good already. You hit suboptimal local minimum loss. But in the ideal world, is you hit the global minimum loss, right? Which means that the model has learned very well, and it learns the underlying patterns. But in this case, it actually approximate the underlying patterns in the training set, meaning it has actually learned what is architecture, right? In this high-rise, in this particular case, the typology of high-rise housing buildings.
So just to jump in there, learning the language, learning the architectural language, do you also then, as part of, you give it this random chance to have inspiration, but do you also then set it with very, very strict kind of like frameworks like, I don't know, Corbusier's modular, or something that it can work within. Otherwise, it's going to be,
So that can be injected as the constraint of the data set, so the curation of the data set. So if I chosen a data set of let's say chairs and buildings, the model eventually learn they are the same thing, and in the end you see this chair-like building-like thing. So in that sense, we could include constraint right from the beginning. And it can be even more complicated. You can include specific semantics meaning. Let's say if I include specific Corbusian annotation within the data set, then in theory, the model should be able to learn, because it's learning based on that kind of decided mapping. The AI model is basically learning that mapping of a given training set and how to approximate the underlying high-dimensional features.
So this constitutes as learning experience for the AI.
Sorry, can I interrupt here? If you don't mind.
Sure.
I just want to clarify that point that Mr. Koh made about Corbusier and
Oh.
how you introduce. I don't know anything about AI, okay, so I will be using the wrong terms or the wrong concept. But from what I understood, you said you use deep learning, which is like teaching like learning Wei Qi, right? Instead of chess.
Uh-huh.
Where you don't even have to set the rules, you just let the machine make the rules.
Well, in this,
In your case,
the
does
rule.
the machine make the rules or you give it the rules?
Well, we define the rules as, technically speaking, the loss. Meaning, so you give it 5,000, let's say, images of dogs, and it generates lots of images, and the loss is whether do they look like dogs. So that is kind of a rule, but without being explicitly stated as if this, then that. If this, then else that. Yeah.
So if you gave it all the images of Corbusier, you don't have to give it any rules, it will figure it out itself, won't it?
Well, it would figure out the underlying patterns if it's consistent enough. So for Corbusier, he went through different stages, right? He has this brutalist and very colorful stage of his career. So more cubic, less organic ones as well. So if you want to generate something that is more in the organic stage of his career, then you shouldn't add the more cubic ones like Villa Savoye, that sort.
No, I mean, this is what we want. This is good, this is great. Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, so thanks for the clarification. I think that's a very important distinction here about the AI. I mean, soon we'll have to give the computer PhDs as well. Let me just jump into the last part of our talk, because we are running a little bit tight on time now. Value. Mr. Ong, what do you hope for your paintings, your works, to convey? What sort of thing do you want to evoke when somebody sees it?
Well, as a painter, we live in our times. And what I do is to depict architectural, culture, the cultural aspect of it. I mean, architecture is one of the cultural aspects of it. The creeds and custom of that era, of the time that I live. Well, a person's lifespan may be long, may be short. So within this short period of time when I'm still alive, I try to paint whatever I can. So you can see that in many of my paintings, I put the date there. 62, 78, 84, 85. So you can see that sometimes I paint the same scene again and again, but you see that it changes. Things change. So that goes for, I'm not comparing with the famous Impressionist artists, French Impressionists.
Like Monet.
Like people like Monet or Pissarro or Van Gogh or whoever. They also have the times, they record the times. When you see a painting, you see the record of times.
I think that's the story in the works, at least to me when I see it. There's this idea of like transformation, urbanization, capturing the moment over time, returning to the same place over and over again, which is quite evident in your Heartlands project.
That's right. Let's say a little advertisement here. Tonight on Channel 8, there's a documentary on one of my paintings that is at the National Gallery at 10:30. It talks about a painting that I painted way back in the 80s. And it is about calligraphy. Then they enlarge into something else, into a story. They enlarge something to go in line with the Chinese New Year, you know. So Chinese New Year is a very festive season. The Chinese New Year of that time. So they even add in documentaries. So a painting can tell a story even wider and further and deeper. You see, it's not just a painting itself. Oh, sorry, Prof. Koh. I was thinking, you know, when I'm sitting here, you talk about AI. Suppose one day the computer has advanced to a stage whereby we can input maybe 100 of John Singer Sargent painting, all the references into this computer. Will the computer be able to do another painting which is not in the list of the 100 paintings by John Singer Sargent and come up with another oil painting? I think that is a possibility, right?
That was one of my questions to you, so you can also take this question. But my context would be, you know, would AI ever become, whoever produce, like, be the next Frank Gehry or the next Zaha Hadid or something, yeah.
I mean, of course, it's in theory possible. You have this AI Zaha, AI John Singer, AI Frank Gehry, but you have to start with John Singer, right? You have to start with Zaha before you get a data set. So you have to start somewhere. And I think the problem is, in order for us to really appreciate, let's say, a building by Zaha Hadid or Frank Gehry, you need the human to give it value, to say that it's meaningful, that it's relevant to this particular era at least. And even the whole star architects, right? Star architects. That is a system that we created, right? We humans created this idea of this idol worshipping of genius architects, and with that we gave them meaning. Because without that, there's this whole actually domain of computation and creativity. That is, even talking about what qualifies as creative, right? So one of them is originality. This Professor Margaret Botan from University of Surrey. And so originality, one of them is value. Sorry, I couldn't remember the third one. So value is culturally, politically, socially constructed.
So, okay, it's going to be a while before we take that, not only for AI to be, you know, like a legitimate artist within the cultural context and accepted as one. Current today, like, okay, with your practice, with your work, what's the value, what's the utility, like, you know?
So during the exhibition I came by, some people were asking me, like some kids, they were asking, hey, this staircase is kind of floating there, what is it doing there? It's not working, and it's not actually structurally, you know, like reasonable, right? You can't just stand on like a few pieces of squares. But we're in the gallery art space, right? So this burden of utility is supposed to be kind of slightly released from. So I have other projects in my research lab in SUTD called, I call it artificial architecture. That's the name of my lab, which is perfect in this artificial city-state of Singapore. Is that I have other projects, let's say with URA, that we look at designing AI models to understand the causal relations between building design that failed to comply with planning regulation, or to understand the conflict or predict the conflict that may exist between different mobility networks, like pedestrian. I mean, these things are pretty serious stuff, not the artsy thing that we're talking about here. But so my work has this other part to it, the so-called reward problem. But I myself is actually more interested, also because of my own artistic upbringing, is the idea, it's not so much about automation, it's really beyond automation, it's the augmentation of the creative process, the creative tools, the creative practices, and even sensibility, right? Yeah, like sensibility, if nobody could appreciate that this is amazing, like Cézanne, right? Nobody really, care about his work in his days, right? Until someone actually appreciate it, fully understand it. So you need that sensibility to exist for it to contribute to the society.
Thank you. Okay, one final question for both of you, the same question for both of you. Can you just sum up for us here, to yourselves, what do you think, in a few words, is essential to this creative process, to the creative process? Mr. Ong, I'll start with you.
Well, I mean, the word creative process, to create is to be original. If you are the first person to create a thing, and that becomes something that's new. So in order to be creative, and to be a painter, or to an architect, or to be a designer, you have to be original. You need to be the first.
Go.
Yes, yeah, actually this whole originality thing is very elusive, right? So the Margaret Bolton mentioned that there are two types of originality. This historical originality, meaning it's set against what has happened before, and personal creativity, which is what is considered creative to yourself. Sometimes we do things we find, yeah, this is pretty creative. This is as far as yourself is concerned. It's not to the art history. But anyway, so I think having this idea of, what are the essentials for creative process is slightly not useful, I think, because in that sense, I think it's more useful to say having an open mind about potentials, and at times this necessary forgetfulness so that we could discard our kind of bias or prejudice or what we think ought to be, say, watercolor, what ought to be AI art, in order to have that transgression.
Well, thanks. That's definitely something that I can actually relate to as well. Hence, putting these two worlds together. So we've come to the end of the talk. It's very fitting that you mentioned John Singer Sargent as one of your inspirations. I have prepared, just very, very coincidentally, a quote by John Singer Sargent too. I'll just read it here, and I thought I want to leave everyone with this. Cultivate an ever-continuous power of observation. Wherever you are, be always ready to make slight notes of postures, groups, and incidents. Store up in the mind a continuous stream of observations from which you can make selections later. Above all things, go abroad, see the sunlight and everything that is to be seen. Thanks. And I also want to thank Mr. Ong, Prof. Koh, thank you. If you want to find out, we're only barely scratching the surface of these topics. So if you want to dive deeper, please chat with them. You can follow him. They were all on social media now, so Mr. Ong, please follow him at Instagram is Kim Seng Artist, right? That's the account handle. And also for Immanuel Koh, you can find him on his website, artificial-architecture.ai, or just on Instagram, artificial-architecture.ai as well. Of course, there are books behind. Just check out the books. You can also purchase them. And yes, thank you and have a very lovely afternoon. Thanks.